Thank you for the recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first webinar engagement in our USAF Helm Engage series for 2023. Welcome to the VCs, the DVCs, academics and lecturers, student affairs leaders and practitioners, colleagues from teaching and learning, staff from all sectors across the university, leaders in the NGO sector, representatives from the DHET, students, colleagues and friends. This is our first meeting this year, and there is clearly a huge appetite to engage with each other in this online format. This online format makes it so convenient and creates wide access, enables people from far-flung corners of the world to join here today, which is otherwise would not be possible. So this online engagement creates access for many of us. We welcome well over 100 people and we're counting, so we're starting a minute late to admit them. So we welcome a large group of participants today, and this is testimony of the great desire in the sector to engage with each other. And also it's about the topic itself. We're all very interested in hearing how to shape a student-centered university, what it looks like, what we need to do, what are the contextual factors that would make it possible, who do we need to be to shape it into a student-centered university and higher education sector. Today, I'll briefly frame this theme, and then we have Professor Andre Kiertz from NMU and Dr. Veer Waal from UFS, who championed this national research, and I'll introduce both of them in a minute. All of us here in this room are familiar with the student-centered approach, and we know that it has implications for our understanding of the student, how we understand ourselves, the content, the pedagogy, and mode of engagement, and it has implications for the institution and wider context. Traditionally, student-centered means that we view the student as an active, motivated, and responsible partner in the learning process, with prior knowledge, a contextualized student who brings her agency to the higher education space. The staff in a student-centered framework. So the staff focuses on the individual learner, is transparent, approachable, and imperfect. The content is relevant and meaningful and is discovered. The pedagogy, you can just silence everyone and come into the room. The pedagogy and engagement are focused on collaboration and recognition of diversity of learning and a variety of engagement styles, and the higher education context recognizes diversity and flexible ways of engagement. We will hear much more from Andre and Veer in a minute, but I want to also raise two caveats. The discourse of autonomy and agency that is explicit in the student-centered approach runs the risk of decontextualizing the student and ascribing a student's success to her motivation, to her engagement, to her agency, neglecting the numerous contextual factors that are often huge barriers to her ability to bring herself into a learning space. Secondly, we need to remember that higher education is not a meritocracy. It's not that when our students bring merit and motivation and agency, that then success is guaranteed. There are built-in barriers and disadvantages for certain groups, and it is hard for an individual to overcome these. It's essential that we contextualize our students and ourselves and our knowledge. So student-centered is much more than a focus on students, and Prof. Kiertz and Dr. Waal will enlighten us around this and remind us that our students, as our staff, are situated and contextualized. And I look forward to hearing about how we can shape the context, that is our institutions and the wider context, become more student-centered. So now for today, we will, you notice we had the recording on earlier, and today we will record the session, and you can review the recordings tomorrow in the YouTube channel, and we'll pop that link into the chat. An evaluation will be sent out at the end of today, and you can evaluate the session. We appreciate that. And we will have question and answers at the end. I appreciate it if you could comment and questions into the chat, and we'll lift them from there. So now to our speakers. Professor Andre Kiertz, with a mysterious second name, he tells me earlier on, So Professor Andre Geertz currently holds the Research Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation and is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation at the Nelson Mandela University in the Eastern Cape. He's a former visiting professor at the Center for Race, Education and Decoloniality at the Carnegie School of Education at Leeds Beckett University in the UK, and the 2018 Marsha Lillian Gladstein Visiting Professor of Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. Andre served as a Director and Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the South African Human Rights Commission and on the Commission for Gender Equality before joining the university sector. Since entering the higher education field, Andre held professional positions at the universities of Pretoria, Fort Hare, and the Free State. He has been serving as transformation advisor and practitioner in various capacities across the sector. Andre, we look very much forward to hearing you in a minute. Our second speaker is Dr. Veerpier Wahl, who has been involved in student affairs for 21 years and currently serves as a director, student life at the University of the Free State. During the past 2 decades, he has been involved in numerous transformation projects involving highly diverse student communities. From 2017 to 19, Dr. Wahl directed the annual Akuha'ai Student Housing Training Institute in South Africa. He's well published, and his scholarly focus centers around creating campus environments that are conducive to student learning, development, and success, especially students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Dr. Wahl served on the editorial team of the Journal of Student Affairs in Africa from 2016 to 22. His most recent book, co-authored with Professor Louis Falik, it's called Accommodating Marginalized Students in Higher Education, a Structural Theory Approach, will be published this year by Routledge. So thank you both for sharing your time or spending time with us and sharing your research with us. As I said, we're recording. We will listen first to Andre, then over to Veerpier, and we will then have a discussion right at the end. Thank you all for being here. Andre, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Birgit, and hello to everybody, and thanks for joining us. And for, of course, Birgit, to you and your team for inviting us and for putting this event together under the USAF banner. It's highly appreciated. So the project has an interesting history, actually rooted in the USAF thinking that the Fees Must Fall movement highlighted the fact that universities have not been designed with the holistic idea of the student in mind. So during its meeting of 29 October 2020, the USAF board approved the following priorities for the transformation strategy group of USAF. So placing students at the center, the reconstitution of institutional culture by focusing on the design of universities to optimize student development and growth. That was the first one. Then the second one was the Engage University, establishing a national project to theorize and to build models of universities that are engaged in the local context in which they find themselves. And you can see how A and B are connected to one another. Then we had the National Higher Education Conference of 2021, which was also part of the TSG priorities. I think there will be publications coming out of that conference as well. Then the fourth priority was the review of practices related to people with disabilities in higher education with a view to improving responses. And the sixth one, positively influencing higher education sector responses to gender-based violence. And of course, the seventh one, inequalities highlighted by the pandemic. And of course, these are integrated 7 priorities of the TSG at that time. This particular project relates to the first priority of student-centered design of university and of course student-centeredness within higher education systems, not only in South Africa, but also in other parts of the world, and especially around the notion of institutional cultures. So based on the recommendations of SASAP, the TSG mandated the research office at the University of the Free State's Division of Student Affairs to lead a research project on student centeredness. The aim of this research project, spanning 2 years, was to create a deeper understanding of how institutional cultures could be reshaped to create a student-centered higher education system in South Africa. The TSG then, of course, approved a research proposal around this theme to be rolled out from September 2020 to August 2022, and we appointed Viepia as the lead researcher through the use of structures. The importance of the research, one can almost argue is self-evident, but just to highlight 2 areas that I think may be of interest to those participating today. The one is that the research is key around the question of the sustainability of the university sector in South Africa and its national development mandate. That is, if we do not attempt to grasp institutional culture in ways that it can be reshaped towards student-centeredness, the sector will find it difficult to generate long-term social legitimacy and advance its learning and teaching mandates in inclusive ways. Birgit, that was also some of the definitional parameters that you set out in your introduction. At another level, the research fills an important gap. We now, I think for the first time, have a sketch, or at least attempt at a sketch of institutional culture and its constitutive parts, and how these may line up with student-centrism as central to the broader transformation imperatives of the sector. So I have no doubt that this work will land within the further work of the Transformation Strategy Group, the Transformation Managers Forum, and transformation practitioners in general. That's apart from the other sectors that are busy with these particular kinds of thematics within our university spaces. 11 days ago, we presented at the USAF board meeting the report that VP will share today with you. The board adopted this report via the structures of the TSG, and the board also adopted the associated student-centered guidelines, which will also be part of VP's presentation. But the board, interestingly, also directed the TSG to decide on how the higher education sector should be engaged on the student-centered guidelines as we move ahead. And this, of course, will be a matter for discussion at the next TSG meeting. So this is where we are at with regard to the broader location of this work, Birgit and colleagues. Our thanks to Viepia and his team, the members of the advisory board, the expert panel, and of course to the TSG and the USAF board, as well as to all the participants and supporters of this particular work and research. So many, many, many thanks for attending. Many, many thanks for making this engagement possible. Your inputs and your insights will most definitely further enhance the applicability of this work. So many, many thanks, and welcome also then from my side. Thanks, Birgit.
Thank you, Andre. We're going over to Viepia. And I think, Viepia, you can share your screen.
Thank you very much, Birgit. Thank you, Andre, also for the introductory remarks. While I share my screen, I can just say this has been a fascinating journey, being part of this project, something that I think the entire team that worked on this project thoroughly enjoyed. So I think I would like just on a high level to start just by highlighting, what we found, what is student-centeredness. And what the data indicated is that at the core of a student-centered higher education system is the formation of the personhood of the student. And the slide, I'll again return to the slide a bit later on in the project, but the slide actually then illustrates that the main goal and the main aim of a student-centered higher education system is the formation of the personhood of the student. Of course, that's constituted by a multi-layered environment represented by the hexagon structures. And the 3 hexagon layers then actually indicate the value layers associated with a student-centered higher education system. The first value layer is interconnectedness, then human dignity, and then equitable access. And student formation is then really the result of the reciprocal engagement between the student and the multi-layered environment, as illustrated in the next slide. And there are 6 contexts associated with the student-centered higher education system. The first context is the personal context, then the relational context, or the microsystem context, as we also know it, the institutional context, the sectoral context, the societal context, and then the international context. So this is just by way of introduction. And then, of course, each one of these contexts, according to the different value layers, can then further be divided into patterns of thinking and feeling, and patterns of what those contexts actually do, behavior and speech. So I thought, let me just start at a high level to illustrate to you what the results were of the research study before I go into the detail of the actual research study. So Andre did indicate the background of the research project. It started in 2020 when the TSG conceptualized the need for such a study. As he indicated, they then approached SASAP, and SASAP approached the University of the Free State. In the second semester of 2020, we then compiled the research proposal that was tabled to the TSG and adopted. And based on that, we compiled the USAF Advisory Board. I'll speak a little bit more in detail about that in a later stage, but the role of the Advisory Board was really to provide overarching guidance, strategic guidance for the research project. In the first semester of 2021, right in the COVID pandemic, 3 members of the advisory board created a conceptual document that helped us to create the conceptual underpinnings of this project. So those 3 people were Professors Ahmed Bawa, Professor Andre Kiet, and Professor Melanie Walker. We then established an expert panel according to the Delphi study. And the second semester of 2021, we finalized the compilation of the expert panel. We got ethical approval from the General Human Research Ethics Committee at the University of the Free State, and we started with the interviews, continued with the interviews in the second semester of 2022. First semester of 2022, we then started with the data analysis. We presented in the preliminary research report to the advisory board, and expert panel members got some input, made alterations, and then we sent out 2 questionnaires. The one was to identify the most essential values associated with the student-centered higher education system. That's a particular point that came out in the workshop in May 2022. And then we sent out a second question in the second semester of 2022 to prioritize the values associated with the student-centered higher education system. And then we submitted the final research report first to the TSG, and then, as Professor Kiet indicated, to the USAF board. The advisory board, there are the names of the people that form part of the advisory board. I'm not going to go into much detail, but we were selective to choose, people that would be able to provide strategic guidance in relation to the transformation research project. So the main research question that we focused on is as follows: how can institutional cultures be reshaped to create a student-centered higher education system in South Africa? And the conceptual framework were actually constituted by 2 documents. The first document is the background discussion document on designing student-centered universities in a student-centered system. That's currently the addendum A of the research report, and that's a document that the TSG created right at the beginning when this project was conceptualized. And as I indicated, very early in this research project, a conceptual framework document was created by 3 members of the advisory board, Professor Bawa, Professor Kiet, and Professor Melanie Walker. We basically worked from two theoretical angles. The one is a social justice framework, and then the second one is a human development and human capabilities framework. And those were the two theoretical frameworks that we used to help us put on theoretical lenses to make sense of the data. In the conceptual document that was created right at the beginning of this research study, 7 conceptual underpinnings or focus areas were identified. Now, this is important because it helped us really as a research team to analyze the data looking through these 7 lenses that were identified in the conceptual document. So the first lens is, just understanding students. So these 7 focus areas were associated right at the beginning as crucial aspects of creating a student-centered higher education system, or actually reshaping institutions to create a student-centered higher education system. So the first focus area is deeply and truly understanding our students. Secondly, understanding faculty members and staff and how ready they were to reshape institutions. The third factor is institutional cultures. How can we understand and reshape institutional cultures? Number 4 is the interweaving between institutions and communities. Number 5 is global awareness and global citizenship. Number 6 is technological impact, digital learning and digital pedagogies. That's an aspect that was added a bit later on, but a crucial aspect. And then the 7th focus areas is the human development and human capabilities framework. Right, so the research design, we decided on a Delphi study with a strong phenomenological approach. The reason for that is really just to, the Delphi method allowed us to really uphold a rigorous study with very limited time and resources. And we felt that that will enable us to really work with expert scholars and expert university administrators, senior administrators of universities, to tap into their knowledge base and experience to uphold the rigor of the study. We did purposive sampling, so we used the 7 focus areas that I just shared with you as lenses, and we chose experts and leaders in the field. I did indicate senior academics and senior leadership and managers. We conducted 22 semi-structured interviews with the expert panel members, and then we did a thematic data analysis process. This is just, the slide is just to indicate that the aim of the Delphi method is to establish consensus amongst a panel of experts. The dark blue blocks, the brainstorm, clarity, get consensus, and prioritize, are actually the 4 movements traditionally associated with the Delphi study. We added 2 pre-steps to first of all identify the conceptual underpinnings of the study, and then to establish categories and panel of experts per category. So the brainstorm session were actually constituted by the semi-structured interviews. The clarification movement was constituted by a workshop that we held in May 2022. The second questionnaire, we got consensus on the values underpinning a student-centered higher education system, and then the prioritization of those values were then done through the third questionnaire. We also worked on the assumption that any large and complex system is underpinned by a value system or worldviews or philosophical underpinnings that actually then direct the arrangement and organization of how the system organizes itself. In other words, how do the system in various contexts actually arrange itself? That actually then gives rise to patterns of behavior and speech externally, and patterns of thinking and feeling internally, which then result in the observable events that we see on our campuses. And this is the sort of the structure that we try to uphold, because we understood from the beginning that we're working with a very large and a complex system. And this conceptual framework actually helped us to make sense of how we should start to think about reshaping the higher education system in South Africa. So I will then use this structure just to report on the data. So first of all, we were interested to understand what are those values that are associated with a student-centered higher education system. So initially from the data, we identified 20 values that these values form part of the initial report that was presented in the workshop to the advisory board and the expert panel members. They felt that 20 values are too many. We need to make it less. And they also actually identified formation. You'll see the third last point on the right-hand side, that formation should be the ultimate goal of a student-centered higher education system. That would be formation of the personhood of the student. We then went into, just asking the expert panel members, identify the 10 most essential values that you think are associated from the list of 19 values. Identify the 10 most essential values associated with the student-centered higher education system. And out of that, we retained all values that received the scoring of 50% and higher. And so from the list of 19, we then could identify a list of 12, narrow it down to a list of 12. And those values were highlighted in yellow on the slide in front of you. We then sent out a subsequent questionnaire asking them to rank the 12 values, the expert panel members to rank the 12 values. We used the Kruskal-Wallis method to analyze the data. And from that, we could identify what we called architectonic values. And the top 3 were actually identified as architectonic values in relation to a student-centered higher education system. So for the value of belonging, a quarter of the respondents put it among the top 2 values, and half of the respondents put it among the top 3 values, and 3/4 of the respondents put it among the top 5 values. For the value of human dignity, a quarter of the respondents put it among the top 2 values, half of the respondents put it among the top 3 values, and 3/4 of the respondents put it among the top 5 values. And for the value of equity, a quarter of the respondents put it among the top 3 values, and half of the respondents put it among the top 4 values. So once we've identified the architectonic values, we then said, well, let's then use that to cluster the other values according to 3 value layers. And so the first value layer is then interconnectedness. All are welcome and valued. And the associated values are empathy, plurality, and transparency. The second value layer is human dignity. All are worthy. And the associated values, quality, integrity, and well-being. And the third value layer is equitable access. All have the opportunity to fulfill potential. And the associated values are adaptability, agency, and awareness. And you'll see, like the 3 layers of a cake, of a 3-layered cake, the 3 value layers then actually form sort of the basis of a student-centered higher education with student formation right at the middle. So I want to move now to the multidimensional contexts associated with a student-centered higher education system. And from the data, we identified 6 contexts associated with student-centered universities. And this is important because we said that the formation of the personhood of the student is actually the result of the reciprocal engagement between the student and the multi-layered higher education system, and also the engagement or the interaction between these various systems. So the first context is the personal context, referring to the personal world, so to speak, of the student. The second context is the relational context, or the interpersonal connections of students, whether it's in a university residence or a student commune or a student association or a classroom, those microsystems where the interpersonal relations actually take place. The third context is the institutional context, referring to the governance and management systems of the university, also referring to the histories, the geopolitical aspects of institutions, and so on and so forth. The fourth context is the sectoral context of the higher education system, and how it also interacts with the broader national education system. The fifth context is the societal context, stakeholder communities in the private and public sectors and communities in which universities exist. And then the sixth context is the global context. I also have to mention that the digital context, or the virtual context, was also mentioned as a seventh context, but we felt in the reporting of the data that that context is actually interwoven into each one of these other contexts, and we then reported it as such. Right, so if I return to this illustration, you'll see from a top view that the 6 contexts are then actually indicated as sort of the slices of the cake, if I can still use that metaphor, indicated if you look from the top on the illustration. Right, we then ask, what are those patterns of behavior and speech and thinking and feeling patterns associated with the student-centered higher education system? So if we understand the values and if we understand the structure or the context, then, if that functions like a kind of a generator, what are the patterns of behavior and speech and thinking and feeling associated with the student-centered higher education system? Now, this was important for us because we understood that once we could identify that in the data, it could serve both as a lens and as a tool to reshape institutions. In other words, once we are able to identify patterns of behavior and speech and patterns of thinking and feeling, we would be able to use that as a mirror to say, to what extent are we student-centered or not in these various contexts. Right, so how did we conceptualize it? We then said, well, if we take the 6 contexts and we place it on a continuum, on the far left side, we then work on a kind of intra-domain, and on the right-hand side, a kind of inter-domain. We could then place these various contexts on horizontal bars. For instance, on the personal context, the intrapersonal context then refers to the personal world of the students, and the interpersonal context on the right-hand side, number 2, refers to the microsystems where interpersonal relations and connections are taking place. In the same argument, on the middle bar, the intra-institutional context refers to what happens inside the institutions in terms of its governance and management structures, and the intra-institutional context refers to the what happens in the higher education sector and the education sector. And the bottom bar, the intra-community context, refers to the society inside South Africa, and the international context refers to the international higher education system and business and labor markets internationally. On each one of these contexts, we then said there's an internal dimension of what is patterns of thinking and feeling, and external dimensions of saying and doing in each one of these contexts. We then superimposed all of this, and for each one of the layers, we then said that we could identify specific pointers on what individuals think and feel, and what individuals say and do in each one of these contexts. So this is for the value layer of interconnectedness. you'll see 36 guideline statements that we identified from the research report associated or ranging across the 6 contexts. This is the slide for human dignity. Again, 36 guideline statements across the 6 contexts, and then for the value equitable access. To give you just a sense of what we're talking about, this is just the example on the value layer of interconnectedness. On the personal context, what individuals think and feel. Students are listened to and feel heard. Students feel physically and emotionally safe, and everyone feels welcome and part of the community in what individuals say and do. We have an authentic, transparent sharing of information. We recognize excellence in teaching and learning practices, and we are professional and competent. And so these are the 6 guideline statements associated with the personal context on the interconnectedness value layer. And so that pattern then just follows for all the contexts on all 3 value layers. We also said that we must understand that this framework is dynamic. In other words, the needs and actually the developmental needs of students change as they journey through the university experience. To put it differently, the developmental needs of a first-year student is very different than the developmental needs of a final undergraduate student or a postgraduate student. So in the research report, we also just indicated that dynamic aspect of a student-centered higher education system. And then lastly, we then said, well, in order to make this very practical, let's create a guideline document. And at the end of the guideline document, we created posters that can actually then be downloaded and shared in the environment. So this is the poster for the personal context of students. And that idea is really that these posters could be used by universities to stimulate conversations. As I indicated, it can be used both as a lens and a tool to reshape institutions. So this is the poster for the personal context. On the left-hand side, you'll see the guideline statements associated per value layer on what individuals think and feel, and on the right-hand side, what individuals say and do. At the bottom, there's a short explanation of the context, and this is then for each context, there's a poster like this. This is the poster for the relational context or interpersonal context. This is the poster for the institutional context, the poster for the sector context, the poster for the societal context, and then the poster for the global context. Right, so the research report, this is just the front cover of the research report, and that will be shared with the sector. And this is the cover of the associated guidelines document. We were a bit naughty. We intentionally worked with the word student-centered guidelines because we understood there are SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and we then said, well, there could also be SCGs, student-centered guidelines. And as I indicated, we've identified 108 student-centered guidelines across the 6 contexts according to the 3 value layers. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop my presentation here and then hand back to Birgit for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
So Birgit, thank you very, very much. It was a lot, it was quite dense, and there were questions about whether you will share the report, and I believe it's available for people to use. One question that was followed on from whether whether the report is available. Question is the report done in such a way that it can lead or can be a roadmap for institutional culture change or change management at higher education? Would you recommend that the report can be used in that sort of way?
Yeah, absolutely. I maybe a roadmap would be stretching a bit too far. I think the idea would be to especially the guideline document to through the transformation strategy group, that we will roll it out into the sector, and that institutions can use this as a catalyst for conversations, and hopefully, as I indicated, also use it as a lens, first of all, to look at themselves, to ask to what extent are we student-centered in these various contexts, and to what extent can we change in a contextualized way our own environment. So the idea is really that it will become a catalyst and a tool to stimulate conversations. Hopefully, this also initiate further conversations, further suggestions, how we could develop a roadmap to reshape our institutions to become student-centered.
So VP, leading on from that, there's a question saying, what are then the metrics if an institution wants to assess itself to see how student-centered are they, or in which domain are they more student-centered than not, and where do they need to focus their energies? What is the metric, or is there a metric that you could recommend?
Right, not yet a metric. I think our aim was just to take the research report, and I mean, it's a 2-year research report, and make it practically applicable to the higher education context through the guidelines document. So that's the heart behind the guidelines document, so that institutions can use those 108 guideline statements as some sort of a tool to initiate conversations. But there's not a metric yet. We are opening up conversations maybe concerning a second phase of the research project that might result into something like that, but unfortunately not a metric per se at this stage. But I do think the 108 guideline statements in and of itself already would be very helpful to institutions.
So 108 sounds an awful lot, VP. That's hard work, huh? There's a question from Elizabeth asking what level the students were when you interviewed them. And I suppose it matters, because if it's first and later years, there would be a different sense of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good question, Elizabeth. We interviewed students who just finished university, graduated, and were in the early career stages. And that was important for us because we wanted to capture the experience of students that went through the higher education system, and that could sort of reflect back on their experience. What we also then did, so part of our research team were 2 Fulbright scholars that came to South Africa. We were very grateful to Fulbright also for funding them and helping with the data analysis process. And I asked them to take the preliminary research results and conduct a focus group discussion with students, current students, and from different academic spheres, different academic levels. And it was really encouraging to find that the focus group, the results of the focus group corresponded beautifully and actually confirmed the findings of the research report. So we did bring in that additional layer to check, our data analysis process through a focus group with students.
There's another question here, and then I've also got a question. Let me hear this one from Ashton. It says, do you think the top 3 values are representatives of the sector, or are representative of the sector? Or should each institution develop their own student-centered values? Is this something generic? The question is this generic? Or would you recommend the institutions themselves find values, student-centered values relevant to the institution?
I think I can say with a high level of confidence that those values are generic. We've identified those values going through all the interviews, all the questions, and those were the values that continuously popped out. And then I've tried to explain that we went through quite a rigorous process to identify the architectonic values, so we placed a lot of emphasis on really identify the architectonic values and creating the value clusters. Using data and data analytics, both qualitative data and quantitative data, because we understood if we really want to reshape the higher education system, we need to do it from a values-based perspective. And so I think it is generic. I think it's applicable to the entire higher education system and to all contexts. I think those are the values that are associated from our data with a student-centered higher education system. Of course, one can always, add to that and engage in more research studies to refine it further. But, based on the data set that we have, those were the values and our interpretation that it is generic to all institutions and across all contexts.
So Vipia, there were 2 questions that related to the how to, so we know what we need to do, and we often know what we need to do in our institutions. We don't quite know how to do it and how to get it right. So student-centeredness is, has to do with the student, and it has to do with how we engage with students and how we trust students and view them and grant them to have agency and be partners in the process. But it also has something to do with how we view staff and how staff relate to one another, how staff are treated at the institutions. I suppose I'm wondering, are there any change management models, or are there any, the question was about staff training models or staff development models that help staff rethink their role and rethink how they engage with one another?
Yeah, absolutely, especially in the relational context of the microsystems, where there's a focus placed on the interpersonal engagements between students, but also between students and staff. If you go through the detail of the guidelines document, those guidelines associated with that specific context speaks a lot about the professional competence of staff. So yes, a lot of emphasis in the data on the professional competence of staff, especially around how to use language to engage students, right? So what we found in the data is it's not enough only to listen to students. It goes beyond merely listening to students to really engaging with students on a deeply human level and connecting with students. And so, of course, one of the biggest critiques against the student-centered approach to higher education is that how do you do that for 45 or 35,000 students, right? And that's exactly why we have embraced a systemic, a multi-layered systems approach to be able to do that. But in short, yes, a strong emphasis on the competence of staff, and then also on the management structures, the institutional context. There's also a lot of things, how do institutions need to recognize good learning and teaching practices? How do they, a lot on policies, how do they need to structure their policies to make it student-centered? So it's not only academic staff, but it's also administrative staff and support staff that needs to be capacitated and be aligned to make the entire institution student-centered.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Sorry, I've lost my questions here. I just want to add to that the issue around that, of course, it isn't just only teaching staff, as central as they are, but it has hugely got to do with how administrative staff, student affairs, the registrar's office, faculty officers, how they engage with students. Often they're the glue, often they're the engagement with students and the face of the institution. Yeah, so very much so. So it's quite difficult to imagine how we would reshape staff or help staff rethink their notion of who they are. I think that'll be quite a challenge. And perhaps you would need to kind of weigh in a bit more on the kind of teaching and learning training programs and those programs. It would be useful, I imagine. There is a question of, again, about students. Tell us a bit more about, so earlier on, Elizabeth was asking, what kinds of students did you ask? And again, there is a question, what was their demographic? What was their socioeconomic bracket? And and how much of the background information of these students was taken into account. Can you say a bit more about that sample?
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I should say, just before I answer that the emphasis of the Delphi study was not to engage students per se. That was not the focus. The focus was to access experts in the field, both in terms of scholarly knowledge, but also in terms of experience. So we were very selective in the purpose of sampling to choose our individuals of the expert panel in such a way that if we engage that person, it would unlock a whole area of expertise, or maybe 20, 30 years of experience working with students that we can tap into. So that's sort of the purpose of the Delphi study, right? So instead of interviewing a vast number of people and getting perspectives from them, rather, through the Delphi study, identified experts, get them onto the panel, and then accessing, 20, 30 years of experience working with students or scholarly knowledge. So that was the approach. But we also felt, let us involve students from, that completed their higher education studies. So I mean, a lot can be said, whether that's representative of the students or not, and probably not of all demographics and not of all academic years and academic disciplines, but that was not the purpose of the Delphi study, and certainly that is one of the gaps of the study that could be addressed by subsequent studies, but we've tried to counter that by introducing the focus group. So I don't think I do justice in answering the question, but that was the nature of the Delphi study.
Nomasomi's got an interesting point about power and about how student-centeredness has a lot to do with who owns the power. Is it the staff, or is it the students, or is it both? Or, and of course, student-centeredness says that power is shared and power is agency is in everyone. In fact, there's kind of an admission to being imperfect, and admission to being human, and admission to be saying, I don't know all the answers, and the students come with their own solutions and come with their own suggestions. So Nomasomi is asking about that students could step up. Do you think students could step up to the expected level of agency, and how would that interface with faculty who are then also holding on to power? Like, well, can you just comment on the idea of power in this model?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and on point. So in some of our earlier models, the research team played even with the notion of that shouldn't we bring in power as a specific axis in our model, that student-centered university would move the power intentionally to the student, right? And we even tried to put that into the models, but it just didn't work. But a strong undercurrent of power, that's present in the data, and the notion that we need to activate the agency of students. So part of forming the personhood of the student is also activating the agency of students, so that on the one hand, the system creates access to support and opportunities, but on the other hand, the system also enables the agency of students to access those opportunities and actually translate that into actionable behavior, where they actually start to participate in curricular and co-curricular activities and accessing the system. So hopefully that comes out in the guideline statements that, in these different contexts, we remove the systemic barriers. That's a huge part of the student-centered higher education system, removing systemic barriers in a diverse way for all students, removing systemic barriers, but also enabling students to activate their agency, to engage with the support structures and the opportunities provided by the higher education system. So yes, absolutely, power is a huge just theme that run concurrently through the data.
Yeah. There is a question from Jackie about whether you also consulted administrative and professional staff in the study, and there was a slide that you showed. But can you go back to your experts, or just the idea of experts and how you chose the field they sat with? I know you also interviewed me. It was a long conversation, and it was so my background is in student affairs, psychology, student affairs, and so I was also interviewed and being on the panel. But were there others also that you included?
Yeah, absolutely. So our method, just again, we used the 7 lenses identified in the conceptual document that was formulated by the advisory board right at the beginning. And we then said, you know, who are the people that would be knowledgeable from a scholarly perspective in those areas, and who would hold in themselves just a vast number of experience, you know, in that specific area, whether, you know, they are, you know, a middle manager or a senior manager, whatever the case may be. So we focused on scholarly expertise, but also experience in that field. And so the kind of people that we approached to become part of the expert panel members were typically senior scholars and researchers in that specific field, but also middle and senior managers of universities. So many DVCs, student affairs, senior student affairs administrators, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we also brought in the students. So that sort of give you a sense of, you know, the kind of individuals that we involved in the expert panel.
So VP, just a comment from my side. I'm thinking about how many of these documents we've seen, we know about what we need to do to advance gender-based justice, or, you know, how to oppose gender-based violence. We know how to advance disability. So we've seen these reports from these national research groups. How do we, I mean, I suppose, you know, we're speaking to the converted here because we're speaking to people who are interested in this. They know the value of this. They know that student-centered approaches work better than other approaches, with all its faults and, you know, all its shortcomings, but it's the better approach for a fairer and better life. How do we leverage this report in our institutions? Is there any weight we can put on it? And yeah, I suppose, how do we leverage it to have student leadership, have institutional leadership embrace it and say, this is what needs to happen, this is what we want to do?
Right. My opinion is, and this is my opinion, there might be different perspectives, that we need to approach it both from top down and from grassroots up. And so one of the suggestions made by Professor Caroline Saransky from the University of Humanistic Studies in the Netherlands, she was one of the expert panel members. She made a very, I think, a very good suggestion. And she said that we should take this framework that emerged from this research project and start to apply it to specific challenges that we face in the higher education sector, like gender-based violence, or first-generation students, or students in transition, or whatever the case may be, and then take that as a model to actually, from a systems perspective, you know, ask ourselves, to what extent are we student-centered in helping students in their transition to higher education, for instance, for first-generation, first-year students, and then apply this in that specific scenario. So I think that was a very useful suggestion from her side in one of the engagements. And I think that's something that institutions can do from grassroots level up. It should be evidence-based, and data analytics should be used to show what is the effect of using this framework. But there's also interest from the vice chancellors through the use of PORT to engage this research report and document further. And I hope in the sector there will also be some initiatives from the top management structures of institutions to engage this document further and in a contextualized way.
So it's useful to hear that that you're saying that if any of us really run into difficulties, as the registrars do and the executive directors of student affairs would do, or the VCs and the DVCs in the rooms, they would be faced with difficulties. And you say then this approach is a useful one to follow, or it's a useful one to remember the values and then govern the interaction, or guide the interaction of how to resolve the problem. So this is a useful framework for that.
Absolutely. And I would be very open. I mean, this is new for all of us, also for me. This is a new framework. And I would be very interested to hear from the different institutions, you know, how is this helpful or not? And to what extent, you know, can it be used, and how can it be used? How have they used it? What are the frustrations, you know, what are the positives and so on? I think in opening up the communication amongst all of us, I think all of us can learn together. And I would be very interested to get feedback from the institutions in this regard.
So that maybe answers the question that Ntsiki had. She said, this is an interesting initiative and the devil will be in the detail. She'd like to see a range of experts who participated. And I think, Ntsiki, you can see that in the report when you access it. And she says the issue is really, for student centeredness, is governed by political connotations. It is influenced by the system, the voices that have power, and the decision makers and the policy makers and the agents and the timing of conversations. So she's pointing out how hard it is really to be student-centered, given all these other influences. And we're going to have maybe one last question from Hani Mabuza. What was the sectoral background proportions of the students? So in terms of health, law, administration, social science, and so forth, representation in the study, and can the findings be generalized to students all over the sector? So that's a question that is about students. Viopi, do you want to just repeat your comments about students? There were some people that were admitted quite late. They were stuck in a waiting room. Don't know how Zoom sometimes works. There are gremlins in the system, but I know there was a whole batch of people stuck in the waiting room, I think, while you were talking in the beginning.
Right. So just again, the nature of this specific study is a Delphi study. That's the method that we chose. And in that regard, we use purposive sampling to choose experts in the field, because the assumption was, you know, with limited time and limited resources, if we access those experts, whether they are scholars or senior administrators with a vast number of years of experience, we would be able to open up a whole field of knowledge or experience. And we wanted to tap into that. The purpose of this study was not to engage a vast number of students, so to speak. So, you know, I would be the first to say this is a limitation in the study, but, you know, that's the nature of research. You work with a specific data set, you do your analysis, you make a contribution to push back the boundaries of knowledge, and that opens up further questions and opportunities for further research studies. I did indicate earlier, for those of you who joined a bit late, that we did take the initial research findings and tested it with a focus group of students, and to make sure that our findings were more or less aligned. And we were very happy to find that there are strong alignment between what was discussed in the focus group in terms of student-centered higher education system and our research findings. But the purpose of this specific study was not to engage a vast number of students, but to uphold the principles of the Delphi study to choose experts.
And you can have another question about, so if we ask students also come with their experiences from high school. So students also come into the sector with a way of being, a way of studying, a way of engaging lectures, a way of thinking, I ought to be like this and that in this environment. So I'm not too sure if our students, or let me just say, I think our students come from a school sector that isn't particularly student-centered. So they come with, for them being student-centered would be quite new and fresh as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so and again, also the kind of students that we get into the environment is also highly diverse, because our school system is just so diverse. So a strong emphasis in the data, and that's certainly captured in the personal context, the very first context that we spoke about, but a strong emphasis in the data on deeply and truly understanding our students. Where do they come from? What are their socioeconomic backgrounds? What are their level of academic preparedness? And how should universities respond to that? And so a strong emphasis on reciprocity between students and providing contextualized and targeted support to the students. So a strong trademark that came out from the data is the responsiveness of university and university systems to the unique needs of a diverse student population, and to what extent are we providing a targeted and differentiated support to our students. So that's a strong trademark or characteristic rather of student-centered universities that came from the data.
And of course, being in student affairs, I'm very familiar with knowing that we need to offer, and it's in the academic sector the same, we need to offer a multitude of modalities of engagement and support in order to respect the diversity of students that we have, because there are different ways of living, different ways of engaging, different ways of learning. And so it has to do with the diversity of offering that we need to do. I'm now coming towards the end, and I'm thinking there is no more questions that I can see. There are no more questions I can see. I can't see any of the other screen coming through. Yipi, thank you very, very much. And I just want to share with the participants that the report is available. Will the link be sent out? I'm imagining the link to the report will be sent out by our technical team to all the participants. You will also receive the link to the YouTube recording, and all the people who registered will receive that link. There is a link for an evaluation in the chat. Please complete that if you have a chance. That means you have to log out and then the link gets activated. I want to, Yipi, I want to thank you very much and your co-researchers for this report. It was a long period that you did that. It was extensive interviews that you did with a huge amount of people. And I know that the research really reflects what the sector feels is needed for the higher education sector to be different and to be more effective and more student-centered.
Thank you very much, Birgit, and thank you for the invitation to engage with the colleagues. And I would love to hear, from any one of the attendees, what they think further, and if they start to apply it and test it in their various environments, it would be lovely to hear and get some feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yipi. I want to also thank our USAF Helm leadership, Dr. Seal, for making these events possible and supporting us in having these national conversations online. I want to thank the technical team in the background, and we will see you again in a month from now. We will have Professor Salim Badat speaking to us, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon further, and I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye. Patrick.
Yeah,
You can pop us into a separate room, perhaps.
sorry.
You can pop me and Virpia and you perhaps into a separate room, or you could ask everyone to go into a waiting room.
And they are leaving.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's great. Okay, now it's just us, is it? Just the three of us, with Virpia.
Yeah.
So Virpia, this was great. This was lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
I think you
exhausted.
handled it well under pressure, because we were dying here, because the host immediately, I was actually stopped this recording. Immediately we changed host,